Falling leaves, rising light. Chapter 25, Invitations kept. Autumn folded into a colder, clearer light, and Jonah learned that the smallest promises often mattered most. He began saying yes to invitations he might once have declined out of caution. A neighbor's potluck, a brief volunteer shift at the food pantry, an evening showing at the community theater. Each was modest, low risk, and intentionally public in ways that let him practice being visible without spectacle. Saying yes was a discipline. It required showing up even when the old anxieties nudged him to stay hidden, and each attendance was a quiet rehearsal in being trustworthy again. The children noticed. When Sophie asked if he could come to her music class, Jonah rearranged a schedule and arrived 10 minutes early with a thermos and a small bouquet of dandelions she'd picked on the way. Emma, whose social life had grown more tangled and professional, sent him an invite to a small gallery opening where one of her pieces was displayed. He stood at the edge of the crowd and watched her speak to people with the steady confidence he had helped cultivate, and when she caught his eye she gave him a brief, private smile that meant, "You were here." Invitations at home were more complex. Mara began to extend them in small practical ways. "Can you take Sophie on Saturday?" Or, "Could you handle library pickup this week?" Which were, beneath their utilitarian surface, ways of resharing responsibility. Jonah accepted most without drama, and when he declined one or two because of work or needed rest, he did so gently and with alternatives. That steadiness mattered. It taught the children that commitments could be reliable even when adults were fallible. He also kept invitations he made. He invited Pastor Reyes and a couple of neighbors for a quiet evening of soup and conversation, deliberately choosing people who had been steady without needing to be told. The night was modest. No speeches, only short stories and shared bowls. But the conversation wandered to practical things: how to teach teenagers patience, how to forgive small slights, how to coax a stubborn basil plant back to life. Those ordinary exchanges felt like training for bigger mercies. They were ways of practicing generosity without seeking entitlement. Work offered invitations of a different sort. A former student invited Jonah to consult on a small renovation project that blended practical drafting with creative challenge. Jonah accepted and found himself delighted by the work's intimacy. Drawings that would become shelves and light, details that would stand long after gossip faded. The job paid little but returned in another currency. Proof that his skill remained valuable and that communities still sought his steady hands. Not every invitation landed well. A family reunion Mara suggested felt like an exam. Jonah declined with careful honesty, citing the need to preserve energy for the children's routines. A neighbor invited him to a civic meeting where tensions about local development sometimes flared. He went once, then stepped back when the tone hardened. Those choices mattered because boundaries and invitation-keeping were siblings. You keep the invitations that build you up and decline the ones that fray you. Keeping invitations became an ethic. Jonah learned to respond promptly, to show up on time, to bring solitude-ready attention rather than an exhausted half-presence. When he said he would come for Sophie's recital, he arrived. When he promised to finish a blueprint for a client, he did it with care. Those small acts, punctuality, follow-through, the habit of not promising what he couldn't keep, reversed a pattern that had once made his presence unreliable. The children's responses were the quiet reward. Luke started sharing small updates unprompted. Emma began to ask his opinion about her portfolio layouts. Sophie, confident in his attendance, tried a riskier solo piece at rehearsal. Trust, Jonah realized, compounded like interest when tended. Each kept invitation made the next one easier for the family to accept. There were moments of tenderness that came unbidden. After a routine school pickup, Emma lingered at the car and said, "Thanks for always being on time." It was small but exact. Sophie left a crayon drawing on his pillow with a label. "For Daddy, who came." Jonah kept that drawing on the tiny shelf above his studio desk and looked at it on hard days. As winter edged nearer, Jonah found the discipline of invitations kept reshaping his life into something fuller and steadier. The practice steadied him in moral as well as practical ways. He became a man whose word meant something again. It did not erase all pain. Old scars still ached in certain seasons. But the pattern of saying yes, showing up, and choosing which invitations to keep created a daily architecture for trust that, day by day, rebuilt a life fit for belonging. Falling leaves, rising light. Chapter 26. After the storm. The winter that followed carried the scent of wet earth, and the hush that comes after hard weather. A storm had passed through town, a long argument at court, a column in the paper that skewed tone but not truth, a week when conversations tightened like wound cords. And Jonah felt the residue in small ways: a neighbor's cautious eye, the children's sudden questions about fairness, the way Mara's silences lengthened on certain nights. After the storm, he learned an ordinary kind of repair: cleaning up fallen branches, sweeping water from porches, mending what the wind had loosened. He found that physical work steadied the more complicated interior work. Hands busy with practical fixes left fewer hours for the mind to spiral, shoveling wet soil, replacing a warped board, readying a sagging gutter were small therapies. He taught Sophie how to knot twine properly. Luke and he lifted a heavy bag of soil together and grunted at the satisfaction of a job done. The house and yard responded in kind, less bruised, more ready for quiet use. There were conversations that only the weather could prompt. Neighbors who had been distant knocked to ask if the roof had held, and a woman from 2 doors down brought over a thermos of soup. Those gestures were modest, no dramatic reconciliations, but they felt like the town remembering how to be neighborly again. Jonah accepted the soup on the stoop and, without ceremony, handed down a spare tarp he'd kept in the truck. Giving and receiving were simple economies that rebuilt trust better than any speech could. Inside, the family practiced a patient sorting of feelings. The children asked direct, honest questions about fairness, about why people sometimes tell partial truths. Jonah answered with care, refusing both defensiveness and easy absolution. He said that people are complicated, that hurt begets hurt, and that truth can be patient. He talked about responsibility and repentance in the small grammar children could hold, actions followed by repair, the courage to admit a mistake, the work of making right when possible. Mara and Jonah managed logistics with a new steadiness. The storm had exposed places where routines were brittle. They rebuilt them with sturdier habits. They agreed on shared calendars that were less like battlegrounds and more like scaffolds. When tempers flared, they deferred to a rule learned in counseling: wait 15 minutes and come back with 3 concrete requests rather than accusations. The rule smoothed some of the sharp edges. It did not remove all of them, but it saved their energy for the things that mattered: kids' recitals, school projects, skillet pancakes on slow Saturdays. Jonah took small, deliberate steps to tend his own weather. He kept counseling appointments, but he also showed up at the gym sometimes, not to punish himself but to keep his body steady. He learned to sleep without the lamp on, to let darkness be a companion rather than a threat. The shoebox stayed in the glove compartment, but its role shifted from evidence to archive. He revisited it less as grievance and more as a map of the distance he'd traveled. There were quiet, restorative moments that felt almost miraculous in their ordinariness. A late-night phone call from Emma, just to say she'd finished a piece and wanted to show him. Luke stopping by with a tray of biscuits he'd made to thank Jonah for advice on a tricky installation. Sophie tucking a scrap of ribbon into his pocket she'd found on the walk. Those small tokens, repeated enough times, became a weather pattern of their own, gentle rain rather than sudden storm. By spring the yard had recovered. New shoots pushed through soil that had been trampled, and the porch held small potted plants that Sophie tended with earnest attentiveness. Jonah sat on the steps one evening and let the air move through him. The storm's memory was still there, the ache, the unfairness, but it no longer defined the whole season. He thought about the way storms rearrange landscapes but rarely end them. Life kept rebuilding, sometimes in surprising forms. Repair, Jonah understood now, was not a single act but a season. It asked for patience, for steady hands, for the courage to keep showing up in the small weather of daily life. The storm had taught him the limits of attempts at sudden glory and the power of ordinary diligence. He closed the day with a simple prayer of thanks. not for vindication but for the small mercies of roof and neighbor and family. And then he went indoors to help Sophie butter toast, to listen to Luke's half-told joke, and to watch Emma's sketchbook in the lamplight. The work after the storm, he realized, was where life truly happened. Falling leaves, rising light. Chapter 27, A Simple Sabbath. Sunday arrived like a held breath, soft, deliberate, an ordinary surrender to slow time. Jonah decided, almost on impulse, to keep the day sacred in the small ways he could control. No work emails, no drafting, no errands that felt urgent only because he made them so. He set the studio's phone to silent, brewed coffee he let steep longer than usual, and left the shoebox closed on the shelf where it had begun to feel less like an instruction and more like history. They went to church as a family in the loose, respectful way of people practicing truce. The service was small and practical. Pastor Reyes chose a passage about Sabbath rest that sounded less like doctrine and more like permission to be ordinary. Jonah listened to the congregation inhale and exhale together and felt, with a grateful surprise, that he could rest without it meaning surrender. The children sang in parts, off-key and brave, and Jonah mouthed the words to himself as if he were learning a new language of mercy. Afterward they walked by the river, the slow current still making small decisions about where to erode and where to hold. Sophie raced ahead and came back with a fistful of leaves. Emma collected odd stones for a new project. Luke kept an easy pace and told a story about a mismeasured shelf that turned into a lesson. Walking beside them, Jonah felt how ordinary gestures could be sacrament, shared steps, hands in pockets, the quiet agreement to keep going together even when destinations were unclear. At home they made a late lunch, bread toasted with whatever herbs the garden offered, soup simmered low, pie that was more gesture than masterpiece. They ate without screens, which felt at first like a deliberate asceticism and then like a rediscovered habit. Conversation wandered from mother to small confessions. Emma admitted a worry about an application. Luke asked Jonah's opinion about a business decision. Sophie announced a plan for a new song. None of it demanded heroic responses. Only steady attention, a careful ear, a willingness to speak plainly. In the afternoon, Jonah lay on the balcony and read, allowing his mind to move without the urgent trimming of to-do lists. He fell asleep for a while and woke to the sound of Sophie's recorder practicing in the yard, notes tentative, and then holding. He felt something settle in his chest like a quiet agreement. He could both protect himself and be present. He could both guard boundaries and practice generosity. That evening Mara lingered longer than usual over a cup of tea. They did not unspool the past. They did not promise cures. Instead they shared small appreciations, thank yous for rides given, nods to patience shown, the rare compliments that land because they are unexpected. The tone was practical and human. Jonah slipped a short note across the table that read, simply, "Thank you for today." Mara looked at it, then at him, and for the first time in a long time the look on her face held neither defense nor calculation but a tired, honest softness. As dusk fell and the house settled into the hush of a practiced Sabbath, Jonah closed his Bible with no fanfare and set it beside the shoebox. He did not imagine that rest would be easy from now on. He knew storms and tax forms and moments of recrimination would return. But he had learned to keep a day where repair could breathe. The simple Sabbath was not a cure. It was a rule of thumb for a life in progress. Show up, rest, notice, and keep the small promises that add up to something steady. Falling leaves, rising light. Chapter 27, A Simple Sabbath. Sunday arrived like a held breath, soft, falling leaves, rising light. Chapter 28, Thresholds of Trust. There were mornings when trust felt less like a thing you built and more like a threshold you stepped across again and again. Jonah discovered that the work of trust required tiny rehearsals, small gestures repeated until they stopped feeling risky. He learned to arrive 5 minutes early, to answer a text within an hour, to show up with exact change or a thermos of coffee when someone needed it. These acts were simple but precise. They taught his children that his presence had a rhythm they could count on. Mara watched the rehearsals with wary relief. She still kept certain doors closed. Private decisions she would not unpack in front of anyone. But she began leaving a cushion for Jonah on the couch, literally and figuratively, a place beside her reserved for calm talk. When she asked him a logistical question, she did so without the old subtext. When he offered to help with a repair, she accepted without suspicion more often than not. Their conversations were quieter now, less theatrical, more like two people learning how to speak without tripping old traps. Jonah practiced trust with himself as much as with others. He noticed where he still waited for betrayal and named it aloud in counseling, then tested it gently. By delegating a minor task at work, by inviting a neighbor for coffee, by letting a late-night call go to voicemail without panicking. Each small experiment either returned a small kindness or taught a limit. Either outcome was information he could use. The children navigated their own thresholds. Sophie, emboldened by a string of supportive recitals, asked Jonah if she could audition for a regional ensemble. His steady yes changed the way she practiced. Luke, who measured loyalty in tasks completed and promises kept, began to ask for advice before making decisions rather than after. Emma, whose world had once been sharply private, let him critique a draft without that reflexive withdrawal. The exchange left them both surprised by how honest conversation could feel safe. Trust collected not in grand reconciliations but in ordinary receipts. A return call, a favor done without fanfare, a meal that arrived when promised. Jonah kept a small mental ledger not to tally favors but to remind himself that fidelity was cumulative. He learned to name gratitude quickly and without theatrics. Thanks for that, that helped. So the currency of kindness circulated rather than stagnated. There were relapses. A harsh phrase from Mara would sometimes reopen old seams. A missed appointment would prick him awake at night. But relapse no longer equaled capitulation. Instead, Jonah treated it as a data point, an invitation to repair in the little way that mattered, an honest text, and offered help, a brief apology without qualifiers. He practiced humility as a kinetic thing, not a posture but an action taken when needed. One night, after a long day of teaching and a messy attempt at dinner that the children declared edible, Mara paused at the doorway with 2 mugs and handed one to him. The gesture was small enough to miss on a busy day but full of meaning, a shared caffeine, an offered presence. They stood on opposite sides of a quiet kitchen and drank. No promises were made. Only a practical peace held the room. Jonah folded that moment into his night like a map, a reminder that thresholds are crossed not in ceremony but in the steady accumulation of small, mutual choices. By winter the thresholds felt clearer. They were not invitations to instant intimacy but markers of safety, spaces where conversation could begin without armor, where children could test independence without falling, where Jonah could be present without dissolving. Trust was never total. It was layered and provisional and, crucially, portable. It lived in pockets, phone habits, punctuality, shared meals, and those pockets made a life navigable. On a morning when frost outlined the balcony railing and the kids shuffled by with scarves and backpacks, Jonah watched them move towards school and felt a quiet confidence. He had not repaired everything. He had not erased the past. But the thresholds had been walked enough times to count. Each small crossing had built a path that held. He stepped back inside, closed the door gently, and wrote a single line in his journal. "We are learning how to come in." Falling Leaves, Rising Light. Chapter 29. The Small Courage of Saying No. Jonah discovered that courage sometimes wore the face of refusal. For years his instinct had been to accommodate, to smooth tensions by yielding, to make himself smaller so other people would feel larger. It had cost him pieces of himself, time, voice, quiet dignity. The vow he'd made in Motel Light had grown into practice, and now refusal became a tool for protection rather than punishment. Saying no was not an act of spite, it was an act of stewardship. He practiced it first with small things. A volunteer shift that would have eaten the only evening he had set aside for Emma's portfolio review. He declined and offered an alternate Saturday. A neighbor's request to lend tools for a project that would have tied him up for days. He declined and suggested a reputable local handyman. Each small no came with a brief explanation and, when possible, an alternative. The shape of his refusal was careful, clear, calm, and honor-bound. The children watched him learn the language of limits. Sophie noticed when he turned down an extra rehearsal to be home for her recital. She hugged him afterward and said simply, "Thanks for choosing me." Luke tested a boundary, asking for money without a plan, and Jonah said no, then suggested a weekend to work together on a budget. Emma, who respected competency, nodded when he declined a last-minute portfolio editing request that would have compromised the quality of his advice. She rescheduled and the result was better for both of them. Saying no reshaped other relationships. Mara, once accustomed to an easy yes that had masked avoidance, sometimes bristled at the new firmness. Those moments were uncomfortable but clarifying. Jonah learned to hold the discomfort, to explain his reasons without defensiveness, and to listen when her frustration revealed another unmet need. The no did not end conversation, it redirected it. At work, refusal became ethical practice. A client asked Jonah to rush a design in a way that would likely cause errors. Jonah refused and proposed a realistic timeline. The client balked but ultimately accepted, and the project completed cleanly. Jonah's reputation for steady competence, not frantic acquiescence, deepened. Students in his class began to see limits not as coldness but as protection for craft. An edited portfolio is stronger than one done in a hurry. Saying no freed space for things that mattered. It allowed him to keep invitations that rebuilt trust, to be present for Sophie's milestones, and to maintain the slow Sabbath discipline he'd learned. It clarified priorities, where his energy would go and where it would not. He discovered that some people respected the boundary, and that others receded, and that both outcomes were useful information. The practice required humility. Jonah still softened refusals with offers of help where appropriate. He still apologized when an unwise no cut someone off unnecessarily. Saying no, he learned, was not an absolute shield but a measured choice that had to be accompanied by generosity and explanation. When he declined something from Mara that had once been routine, washing a mountain of dishes after a late meeting, he offered to take over Saturday morning chores as a trade. The exchange translated refusal into partnership. One late autumn evening, Jonah turned down a speaking invitation that would have required a week away during a crucial recital season. He explained gently, thanked the organizer, and suggested a colleague who could step in. When Sophie hugged him that night and said, "You didn't miss my song," the gratitude landed like a benediction. The small courage of saying no had become, in practice, a way of saying yes to the things that truly mattered. He wrote the choice into his journal not as pride but as record. Said no, protected presence, kept promise. The sentence was spare and steady. Saying no had taught him an unexpected grace, the freedom to keep his life small enough to love well and wide enough to hold others without losing himself. Falling Leaves, Rising Light. Chapter 30, A New Ordinary. The year had folded again, not with fireworks but with the steady hush of routine. Jonah woke one morning and noticed, with a small, surprised gratitude, that the sharp edges of the old seasons had worn round. He could sleep through a storm without waking to rehearse catastrophes. He could take a call from Emma about a portfolio detail and answer without the reflex to appease. The change was not dramatic. It was the soft accumulation of many ordinary days done differently. He found himself hosting a simple breakfast on a slow Saturday. Pancakes that burned at the edges and coffee that was too hot, and the children hovered at the little kitchen table like a constellation that still fit. Luke complained about the syrup. Sophie insisted on passing butter with exaggerated ceremony. Emma showed him, quietly proud, a small freelance gig she'd landed. Conversation meandered toward the mundane and settled there comfortably. Jonah listened more than he spoke and found that silence no longer felt like a threat but like room for others to arrive. Work felt the same way, steady, useful, lacking nothing heroic. He taught a semester, finished a community job ahead of schedule, and took on a small commission that let him sketch at dusk with a lamp on and a dog-eared Bible on the windowsill. The studio held the soft disorder of a lived-in life. Tools where they were needed, a stack of student portfolios by the door, the shoebox tucked away not as an anchor of grief but as the kind of archive you consult and then set down. Mara and Jonah had new rhythms. They negotiated schedules with fewer sparks and more practical language. They agreed on times to discuss things and times to rest. There were still nights when old stories surfaced, sharp and unsettled, but they came with the new ability to step back, name a need, and return later with fewer accusations and more workable asks. The children, in the middle of it, learned that families can change shape and still hold tenderness. Jonah's vows remained, sworn never again to lose himself, to say no when needed, to keep invitations that mattered, but they had settled into him like a worn jacket, reliable, familiar, not ornamental. He found joy in the small, precise habits that had once felt new, replying promptly, showing up on time, sitting through a long recital without checking the clock. These habits had the soft dignity of faith lived practically. One evening in late spring he sat on the balcony with a thermos, watching Sophie's string wind chimes while Emma edited a portfolio photo inside and Luke tightened a loose board below. The scene had no overt drama, it had light, noise, small care. Jonah felt, in a way that was almost physical, the feeling of arrival, not to an endpoint but to a steadier path. He closed his journal and wrote one line. Here, and keeping the small things. It was not an endnote but a quiet affirmation. Life, when tended in modest strokes, becomes enough. Falling leaves, rising light. Chapter 30. A new ordinary. The year had folded again, not with fireworks but with the steady hush of routine. Jonah woke one morning and noticed, with a small, surprised gratitude, that the sharp edges of the old seasons had worn round. He could sleep through a storm without waking to rehearse catastrophes. He could take a call from Emma about a portfolio detail and answer without the reflex to appease. The change was not dramatic. It was the soft accumulation of many ordinary days done differently. He found himself hosting a simple breakfast on a slow Saturday. Pancakes that burned at the edges and coffee that was too hot, and the children hovered at the little. If Jonah's story resonates with you, hit like so others can discover it too. And subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart.